And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard with a new year. It is Thursday, January 2nd, 2025, and this is your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan, and we start out with the ice. We have polinias that have opened up along the northwest coast here of the Chukchi Sea between Utqiagvik and Point Lay. Otherwise, the ice continues to build with the cold temperatures in place. It's filled in south of the Bering Strait, all of Norton Sound, though again, some openings there between Golovin and Chaktulik. As we drop down further south along the areas of the YK deltas, we've had the ice fill in Etolin Strait into areas of Kuskokwim Bay. Still not much here around Bristol Bay. And the pattern is such, we do have a push of Arctic air that's going to work its way from the interior westward out into the Bering over this early weekend. And once that happens, then low pressure is going to be coming up out of the North Pacific into the Gulf. And milder temperatures are going to be returning, especially along the Gulf Coast into southern Alaska and the Panhandle as we go through next week and next weekend. Definitely a stormier pattern will be shaping up through this region. So for late tonight, early Friday morning, we have a weakening low in the North Pacific, south of the Gulf with this trough, just kind of pulling northwestward. Could have a few light snow, rain showers with it. And then a low that's southwest of the Aleutians with this occluded front. Still some gusty winds along that, some gale force winds. But the main weather maker right now is this Arctic high over the Yukon Northwest Territories here. And it's creating some very cold temperatures. Nighttime lows into Friday morning, 50 below zero around Fort Yukon. Areas where it doesn't get that cold, you're going to still be 20s, 30s below, but with breezes coming through some of these valleys and gaps. So we're looking at wind chills 40, 50 below. We have extreme cold advisories here for the northern Panhandle, Thompson Pass, up through 40 Mile Gold Country, Eagle, down in through this whole area of the Copper River Basin east toward McGrath. Could see some wind chills around 50 below zero, if not air temperatures of 40 below. So by Friday afternoon, we still have kind of a split high pressure there over northwest Canada, 1046 millibar high, weakening trough to the south in the Gulf here. And then this low, the occluded front just kind of weakens and extends out. This is all leading up to a pattern shift. Now the colder air, as it comes westward from the interior, it will modify and then push out over the Bering Sea. But generally an easterly flow of air here across the mainland. But then we start to see the shapings of fronts and moisture coming back to the north. This will be the first in a series of lows that comes northward as we go through the later weekend. And by the time we get into next week, game is on. There'll be a series of lows and fronts coming up into the Gulf and impacting the Panhandle, northeastern Gulf Coast with heavier precipitation and wind. So keep that in mind as we transition out of this weekend and the early new year. So we're looking at for Friday north winds, the inner channels of the Panhandle, as much as 30 knots, gust of 45 knots. That cold air just coming down Lynn Canal. Waves could be upwards of 10, 12 feet. Stevens Passage, north winds 25 knots, 12-foot waves. And then Dixon Entrance down here south of Ketchikan, Metlakatla, maybe 4 or 5 foot waves. For the outer coast, generally east or northeast winds between 20 and 30 knots. Gusts could be as high as 35 knots there off of Craig. Waves running 10 feet. And then Saturday, still north winds 25 knots, Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, 4 or 5 foot waves. Easterly winds 20 knots down here through Ketchikan, Metlakatla, waves 3, 4 feet. Easterly flow continues along the outer Gulf Coast and with 25 to 30 knot winds, waves 7 to 8 feet. Across the northwest Gulf, Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, northeasterly flow for Friday, 20 knots within Prince William Sound, 25 to 30 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, and then as we drop down through the middle lower Cook Inlet, look for northeasterly winds to 30 knots with waves of 6 to 7 feet. These winds are going to increase because I was telling you about that low coming out of the North Pacific. That's going to be the lead low that is one of many. And as that approaches from the south, this northeast gradient will be increasing, as will the winds, 30, 35 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance on Saturday. And we're looking at 40 to 45 knot northeast to east winds here, lower Cook Inlet and off the Kenai and northeast of Kodiak City, with waves running on the order of 9 to 13 feet, highest there just northeast of Kodiak Island. Winds will be northeasterly on Friday across Kodiak Island, as much as 30 knots, 7-foot waves, Shelikof Strait. They become more easterly, 25 to 30, even 35 knots there near and south of False Pass. 7 to 10-foot waves on the North Pacific side, 4 to 7 feet on the Bering side. Then for Saturday, 40-knot northeasterly gales through Shelikof Strait, waves up to 11 feet. Otherwise, easterly winds going out along the peninsula, with the North Pacific side east at 30 to 35 knots, waves 10 to 12 feet. Northeast to east winds 25 knots on the Bering side, with waves of 5 to 8 feet. As I mentioned, the occluded front that's lifting northward across the Aleutians Friday, we're looking at gale force winds along much of the Aleutian chain. Easterly 35 to 40 knots most areas, with the exception of southwest of Adak and Kiska, but that's because the front will be lifting further north, higher seas here in the lower Bering in excess of 20 feet. And then on Saturday, we still have gale force winds 35 to 40 knots out of the northeast in the western Aleutians. Those winds easterly to northeasterly, right around 25 knots for the eastern central Aleutians on Saturday. And then here for the southwest coast, winds will be offshore out of the northeast right around 25 knots. We have that Arctic air that's just pushing westward. So out of Norton Sound, down along the YK Delta, coming out of Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay's northeast winds 25 knots. As much as 35 knot east-northeast gales St. Matthew down through the Pribilofs, where gusts could be as high as 45 knots from the east along the Pribilofs for Friday. And then on Saturday, we still have actually winds even stronger coming in off of the mainland. We're looking at a northeasterly offshore flow, 25 to 30 knots common, as much as 35 knots here in this wider expanse of Norton Sound. So the ice is going to have a tendency to want to push westward and maybe a little southward. Still 40 knot gales out of the northeast there at St. Matthew, 30 knot northeast winds with 12-foot waves there at St. Paul and St. George. Now, areas along the western Seward Peninsula, 15-knot offshore flow, but 25-knot northeast winds on the north side of St. Lawrence Island at Gamble and Savunga. Easterly winds out of Kotzebue Sound at 25 knots. And then as we get up north Wainwright, we have easterly winds to 30 knots. And then coming across the Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 20 knots, Utqiagvik, northeast 15, Prudhoe Bay, but then westerly 10 knots at Kaktovik. And for Saturday, those westerly winds around 10 knots continue at Kaktovik. Northeasterly around 10 knots, especially Prudhoe Bay through Utqiagvik. And then dropping down through the Chukchi Sea coastline, east to northeast winds 20-25 knots. Again, plenty of ice in place. And then as we drop down through the Bering Strait, we could see 35-knot gales out of Norton Sound and along the north side of St. Lawrence Island on Saturday, especially at Gamble.